I've been a learning coach for over 13 years. I've spent thousands of hours learning about learning, and I've taught this skill to tens of thousands of people. It's no exaggeration to say that learning to learn for me has been life-changing. I went from studying 20 hours a day, desperately trying to enter into medical school, to working as a doctor while running a business full-time and ranking first for my Masters of Education after a month of studying. For the students and professionals that I coach, learning to learn has not only given them better results and performance, but also the confidence to progress in their career, make more money, pass competitive examinations, while earning back valuable time to spend on friends and family. But learning to learn is not straightforward. For me, it took years of experimenting and reading through complicated research to figure it out. So in this video, I want to give you a single place to get started. I'm going to teach you how I think about learning as a learning coach. I'll teach you some tactics, but most importantly, I'll teach you the principles and approaches you need to have. Because tactics change depending on what you're learning and what your goals are, but principles remain the same. So I'll teach you the principles and the process you need to follow to master complex skills and knowledge in half the time. And there are 4 parts to this video. In the first part, I'm going to bust some common learning myths. I'm starting with busting myths because they're really problematic, and it's maybe even more important than teaching you the learning tactics themselves. These myths are fundamental blockers to improving. If you believe these, you will not improve. And they are so common that over 95% of people believe in at least one of them. So that's the first part. With the myths out of the way, I'm going to move into the second part where I talk about how you can create a learning system. Learning is messy and it's complicated and it's also invisible. It's really hard to improve at something if you don't even know how to think about it. So one of the most important first steps to become more efficient at learning is to see learning as a system as opposed to a cluster of methods and techniques that you just use every now and then. Once we see the components of our process as part of a learning system, we then look at which part is holding us back and then work on that. Just figuring out how to think about learning as a system probably took me 2 years. As I explain about the learning system, I'll also be teaching you about the science of memory and how your memory works. And so this part can be quite large. It'll be broken up into multiple different segments depending on each component of the learning system. With that covered, in the third part, I'll go through the different orders of learning. One thing I've realized that makes learning to learn really difficult is that there are so many different ways we need to use our knowledge. When you're learning for an exam, it's different to learning for your job. And even at your job, different types of decisions and problems require different types of learning at different levels. And so I'll teach you how to think about all those different levels in a really easy and productive way. When you know how to think about the orders of learning, it gives you a really clear goalpost. You know exactly what level you need to aim for, and you know what you need to do to be able to achieve that level. You can assess whether your own learning is effective or not based on how well you're achieving that goal. And because you can assess that yourself, you can improve and you can iterate on your learning ability much more quickly than having to ask someone else for feedback or getting an exam result back to get feedback. And then in the fourth and the final part, I'll go through some crucial self-management skills. Self-management refers to the way that you manage your time, your priorities, your focus, and your attention. Self-management is what allows you to have the time and the energy and the concentration to do effective learning when you need to sit down and actually do it. If your learning skills are great and your self-management skills are useless, overall, you're going to be useless. And there are a lot of misconceptions and advice that I've seen floating around there that I think makes self-management harder than it needs to be. So I'll teach you some simple principles and strategies that you can use that will solve most of your biggest self-management issues. Now, as you can see, this is not a short video. And by the end of this video, you're not going to be the world's best learner. Learning to learn takes time. And if you're not willing to spend that time to learn the skill, then you're not going to learn the skill. But for those of you that are willing to put in the work, this is your ultimate beginner's guide. So first, let's start with busting some myths. The first two myths actually, are the time and IQ myths. Let's say that you're struggling with your learning volume. You've got a lot of work, you've got a high workload, there's lots you need to learn, there's lots you need to keep up on, and you've got other things that you need to do. You need to get your job done, you need to spend time with your family, and you need to do your everyday household chores. And on top of that, you're meant to get enough sleep and exercise regularly. There's a lot of stuff on your plate. And on top of that, you have all the stuff you need to learn. And so it can feel like you're on this hamster wheel where you're just constantly trying to keep up and you never have enough time. And while feeling that way is completely valid and accurate, the way we interpret that problem is a myth. Because the myth is that we don't have enough time, or that I'm just not smart enough. I don't have the IQ points to be able to learn all this stuff so quickly like other people can. Or my memory is just not that good, so it takes me a lot longer than other people. And while that's partially accurate, everyone's different, everyone has different levels of sort of baseline intelligence. They don't need to have the processing power of the world's smartest scientists. They don't need to have the memory of a memory champion. Just being able to increase your attention by 20, 30%, being able to understand things 20 to 30% more deeply, seeing how things fit and connect together 20 to 30% more easily, that translates to 20 to 30% more free time that's available for you. That could be an entire evening that's now freed up. That's an entire weekend you don't need to spend. That's 20 to 30% more difficult problems and more complicated issues that you can deal with. That could be a promotion. That could be a salary raise. Everyone can get 20 to 30% more effective than they are now. And actually, if you think about it, it's only logical because most people are terrible with their learning. Their learning strategies and the methods and the systems they're using are not very sophisticated. And also, it's not your fault. If you were like me, no one taught you how to learn properly. No one told you what the science of learning is. No one told you how your brain actually works. And even for me, when I was going through and reading through the research and understanding this, it's complicated, like really complicated. And it took me over a decade of reading the research and applying it and experimenting and teaching it to thousands of people that allowed me to see how it can really click and how your brain is actually meant to learn. So the two myths that I want to come back to here is that it's not about not having enough time. That's not the real problem. The real problem is that it takes you too long to cover what you need to cover. The problem is that the time you do have, you're spending it on relearning the things that you're constantly forgetting. The issue is not a lack of time. The issue is a waste of time. And that comes down to your process, the way that you learn. The issue is also not because of your IQ or your intelligence or your memory. Your ability to learn can be trained. And even if everyone's genetic potential is different, everyone can be 20 to 30% better. And that is a significant improvement to your life. And today, in this day and age, learning to learn is the most important skill that you can learn. It is more important than learning about AI or learning about coding or whatever else you're learning about. Nothing is going to make you more competitive in the job market than being great at learning. In fact, it is because of AI that it is so important. Because now you can't get away with just learning the bare minimum. AI already does the bare minimum and more, and it does it faster, better, and 1,000 times cheaper than you. You do not have any competitive advantage to bring to the job market if all you can do is learn to do things at the bare minimum. Now, what employers are increasingly expecting of you is that you can do more than before. You can solve harder problems and you can solve them faster. And whether or not you can do that depends on how quickly and efficiently you can learn. Now, the second myth is the learning styles myth. In other words, the myth that refuses to die. If you're not familiar with the learning styles myth, it's saying that everyone has a unique learning style. A common way that people talk about this is visual, auditory, read and write, kinesthetic, but actually any way of categorizing it by saying, I learn through this. I'm better at learning in this way rather than this way. This is a myth because decades of high quality, very reliable research has shown that the human brain is capable of learning in multiple different ways, and people generally do not have a set style of learning that is better for them. What that means is that there is not a style that is more suited for you, that's different to someone else, and so for you, you should learn to use that style more. That is not true. And probably one of the reasons this myth refuses to die and is actually still taught. Like I've worked with universities, like teacher training organizations, people that are meant to be teaching people how to learn, and they still have learning styles in here. You have to understand that this is not one of those things where there's like one or two papers out that say that this is not true. Like, this is to the point where people are not really studying whether learning styles exist anymore, because the research is so conclusive that we're moving on to other things. People are now researching, why do people keep believing in this myth? And the reason people probably keep believing this is that it seems to be counterintuitive. It goes against our own lived experience that there are certain ways of learning that seem to be more effective and work better for us. So surely the research is missing something. And that is also a totally valid feeling. And the thing is, the two things are not contradictory to each other. Here's the reality. First of all, most people are visual learners. This is because the human brain is extremely efficient at processing visual information. Compared to how quickly you can process written information, your visual information processing ability is tens of thousands of times faster. And this is true for everyone, unless there is a pretty significant medical abnormality. And the easiest way to test that, if I show you a photo of something, how long does it take for you to understand and process the information from the photo versus if I explain to you every single thing going on in that photo and I write it out in paragraphs? However, another aspect of reality is that most of us grew up in a very reading and writing dominant education system. And so a lot of the habits and the preferences we have for learning are reading and writing dominant. And this is the reason why, other than visual learning, reading and writing tend to be considered the most common and most effective styles of learning. Now, you might be thinking, well, if I feel like I'm able to learn more effectively with visual learning compared to listening to someone, which most people struggle with, by the way, or I feel like I need to sit down and write out my notes in order for me to learn it, doesn't that mean I have a learning style? That's a good question. And the answer is actually surprisingly no. What you're talking about are actually learning preferences. And here's the difference. This is the key part. Learning styles as a theory says that each person uniquely has a learning style that is more suited for them. And so they should lean into that learning style. If you are a visual learner, you should do more visual learning, and that's where you're going to get your most efficiency from. And your brain is probably not wired to be good at the other styles of learning. Now, what we know from years of very thorough research is that we do have learning preferences. Learning preferences say that there are certain ways that your brain is better at processing information, but those things tend to be the same for everyone. Everyone tends to be better at visual processing. Reading and writing tend to be a habit that we have. So each of us have different habits of learning. But the difference here is that it isn't a good idea for you to double down on the particular habits that you feel have been effective for you in the past. Even if you're more comfortable with a visual or read and write or an auditory or experiencing, like doing stuff style of learning, there is always an advantage for you to learn how to learn through these other modalities and styles. Mixed modal learning is advantageous for everyone. And also, as a working professional, you don't get to choose how you learn things sometimes. If you really struggle with learning when someone is explaining something to you, and every time you learn, you have to have a diagram or you have to go away and sit down and write copious amounts of notes to be able to learn effectively from that, that's going to be a pretty big limitation in your life. And that limitation doesn't have to exist. So yes, you can have learning preferences and habits that you're more comfortable with, but that's just your starting point. But it is a myth to think that that cannot change and evolve. And it is unwise to think that it shouldn't change and evolve. So that's the learning styles myth. The next and final myth is that learning should be easy. Learning is a big and complicated process. It's very energy consuming. Your brain has to do a lot of stuff to create effective learning. It's not like breathing or walking, where your brain can basically do it automatically without even being aware of it. And research that looks into the behaviors and learning strategies of high performers versus low performers has found a difference in something that's called the misinterpreted effort hypothesis. It basically says that most people when they use a learning strategy that makes it feel like they have to work harder and think harder, maybe get a bit more confused and work through that confusion, they perceive that that feeling is undesirable. That if I feel this way when I'm using this strategy, it means that the strategy is not effective. However, this is incorrect. This is the misinterpretation of the effort. Feeling and thinking that way is actually a good thing. It actually means that your brain is engaging at a higher level, kicking it up a gear, and that is going to result in better retention, better memory, deeper understanding. But instead, what happens and what most people do is that they'll use a technique that is effective, they will think it's not effective, and then they'll actually go back to a technique that they think is more effective because it feels easier. This is sometimes referred to as a counterproductive adjustment. And so when I go through in this video and I talk about the learning system and I talk about different tactics and principles, you're going to see this come up over and over again. You're going to see the trend of engaging your brain, thinking actively, thinking deeply. It's not going to be a walk in the park, especially if you don't have these habits of really active learning and most of your habits are around rote memorization. This is going to be challenging for you. And when you feel this is challenging and then you feel, oh, this is not working, I want you to remember this. Learning is not meant to be easy. And you don't need learning to be easy. What you need is learning to be effective. You need learning to be efficient. And the cost of effective and efficient learning is effort. And that's mental effort, not spending more time. I'm not saying work harder, put in more hours. I'm saying when you do put in the hours, think deeper. Push yourself to a higher standard of thinking. Put in the mental effort that's required for effective learning. If you don't do that, you will not be better at learning. And there is no amount of tactic or strategy or principle that is going to help you. So that's myths. Now, let's think about building a learning system. When I do workshops or seminars or even one-on-one coaching, and I ask someone, how do you learn? What's your learning process look like? Most people can't tell me. It's very, very vague and very superficial. It's like, I'll look up something and I'll read some books. We don't normally think about learning and the process of learning. It's not a common everyday thing to think about. And so as a result, when we have an issue with our learning, like it takes too long, our memory is not good enough, we don't understand things deeply enough, we can't solve complex problems, we write notes for hours and then 3 weeks later we come back to it and realize we don't remember any of what we wrote. When we have these problems, we don't know how to fix them because we don't know how to think about this. And so while there are many ways of thinking about this, this is one particular perspective that I think is pretty easy to understand and pretty useful for problem solving. There are two main components that we need to anchor into as part of a learning system. The first part is encoding. The second part is retrieval. Now, this is going to be a simplification of some really complicated research, so it's not 100% accurate, but it's accurate enough for it to be useful for you. Here's what happens. Information comes into your brain. Your brain does a series of processes. It thinks about that information in all sorts of different ways. It filters it. It asks itself, how is this relevant? Why do I need to hold on to this? What is it connected to? Where does it fit? And after going through that process, the symptom, the outcome, the byproduct of doing that process is that we create memory. Memory is this artifact, this byproduct of the process of just thinking about information in certain ways. And that process of thinking about this new information, seeing it from these different angles, seeing how we can fit it into our existing knowledge structures, this process is called encoding. So when you do encoding really well, it produces more of these memory byproducts. So your memory is stronger. It's stickier. You're not going to forget it after 1 or 2 days. You're going to forget it after 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months even. If it's incredibly important and the encoding process is done, very, very extensively, then you may not forget this for years, decades even. If you find out that you're about to have a child, you're not going to forget that anytime soon. You don't need to create flashcards and say, what am I going to have again? Is it a pet or is it a child? And then go through every single evening, testing yourself. Oh, it was a child, of course. And then, repeat that on your spaced repetition algorithm. Having a child means a lot. It affects you in all sorts of different ways. every way that it affects you, that is one connection that's being formed. That's a way that your brain is trying to see how this new information fits in the big picture of your life. And because it fits in so many different ways, there's lots of memory created from that. Whereas if I tell you, hey, I need you to pick this thing up for me at this address, 419C flat 3 on this road, you might not remember that for even like 15 minutes because those numbers mean nothing to you. Whereas that exact same address, those exact same numbers, if I said, hey, I need you to pick this up from this address, and you think, wow, I used to live at that house, you're going to remember that address because it means something to you. This is the way that your brain is meant to work. We want this to happen. You don't want your brain to be remembering every trivial, random, irrelevant piece of information. Things that are relevant, that have an impact, that are worth remembering, you want your brain to remember. And the things that aren't and that are random, isolated bits of information, you want it to prune out. Now, the issue is when that random, isolated piece of information is something that you actually need to learn for your exam or for your job, and you don't see how it's relevant, but you do know you need to remember it. That becomes a problem for your brain. You're basically telling it to do something that it's not built to do. And effective encoding as a part of your learning system, having the skill of encoding, means you know how to turn that information that feels irrelevant into something that is relevant and connected. You have the skill of finding patterns, perspectives, angles, connecting and applying that information in such a way that it tells your brain, hey, I know you thought this was not relevant and you want to throw it away, but actually, if you think about it in this way, you can see how it's really important and worth holding on to. That's the skill of learning, but that's encoding, right? That's new information coming into your brain. What do you do with that information to turn it into memory? Retrieval, on the other hand, is when this information already exists stored in your memory. You've already done the encoding. And retrieval is when you pull this memory out and you use it. Anytime you use it as a form of retrieval, explaining it to someone, solving a problem, answering a question, just randomly reciting facts, as long as you're doing it from your memory, that is retrieval. Now, retrieval is important for a couple of things. First of all, you need to retrieve the knowledge for it to be useful. Like, unless you're just learning something because you just have joy in knowing things, usually the reason you're learning it is to use that knowledge in some way. That involves retrieval. So you need to be good at retrieving the knowledge in the right way. If you learned something and you encoded it in a way that is very isolated, very random, far removed, just rote memorization, but the way you need to use that is for complex problem solving, nuanced discussion, answering complicated questions from an expert. The way you encoded that knowledge is not going to be useful. Even though it technically exists in your brain, you don't know how to use that. It doesn't connect in the way that it needs to connect. So you're going to struggle. And that is part of being good at retrieval, is practicing retrieving the knowledge in the way that you need to retrieve it before you actually really need to retrieve it. And the other benefit is that by doing this retrieval, it also helps with re-encoding it. So there's actually this cycle that happens where every time you retrieve information, it also helps to strengthen and consolidate that knowledge. And this is really important because if you are not good at encoding, the issue is that your memory is going to be bad. So poor encoding leads to poor retention. It also leads to superficial understanding. And what that translates to is usually not being very good at complex applications of knowledge, like solving complex problems, having deep discussions. So if you're trying to become an expert at this thing, you're a tech lead learning about a new tech stack, and you know that the people that you need to answer questions from, important stakeholders that are going to be throwing all sorts of different perspectives at you, the level of expertise you need to build is pretty high. So if your encoding quality is low, you're going to struggle with that. Now, on the other hand, if your retrieval is poor, so poor retrieval, this leads to a drop in your knowledge fluency or your ability to recall that quickly. It also increases the risk of there being gaps in your knowledge that you didn't detect. Because you don't retrieve the knowledge to test yourself, you don't realize that there's a gap in your knowledge or that you've understood something incorrectly. And so one of the purposes of doing retrieval is to find those gaps in your knowledge before it really matters. And sometimes you don't need to do deliberate retrieval to mitigate this risk. Like you might be able to learn something, produce something, apply it into your work, and you just present it. And if there are mistakes and if there are gaps in that, you just either figure it out along the way, or you present it and you get feedback saying, hey, this is wrong, and then you go fix it. Like it may not be a significant consequence, but it's worth understanding that retrieval is a tool that helps to mitigate that risk, because sometimes you won't have that flexibility. Let's say that you have to present something at a conference and you need to really know your stuff. You don't want to be on stage answering a question for the first time and realizing I've never thought about it from that angle before and now I look like a fool. You don't want to be sitting that really important exam and realizing for the first time, oh yeah, I've forgotten this, or I've never thought about it this way before. I've never tested myself in this way. But the other issue with poor retrieval is that it increases knowledge decay. And knowledge decay is basically the fancy technical term for forgetting something, memory fading away. And this is something that you should have an understanding of. If you learn something for the first time, your knowledge decay is going to be at a certain rate. So in this case, this might be quite steep. So let's say that this is after 1 day, and this is your day 0. So you learn something on this day. So this axis is time, by the way, and this is the level of knowledge that you have left in your memory. So if you learn something on day 0, after 1 day on this graph, maybe that's dropped to 10%, which means that you forgot 90% after 1 day. Now, let's say 6 hours after learning it, you decide to test yourself on this knowledge. So that's going to happen, let's say around here. So you do a retrieval practice and you try to recall this from memory. And then you reconsolidate this knowledge. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to see, hey, I've forgotten like 50% of it already. I'm going to relearn that 50%. And then as you consolidate it, because of the fact that retrieval itself helps with re-encoding, what's going to happen is that that knowledge is now going to decay a little bit more slowly. And so after another, let's say 1 day from that, so this is, let's say, day 2, your knowledge is not decaying all the way down to 10% anymore. At this point, now it's only decaying down to, let's say, 40 or 50%. And again, if you were to test yourself again and do a retrieval session, this is going to be even slower. And here you have what we might call residual long-term memory, where even after, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks later, your knowledge might still be at 80% retention. And this is a good place to be in, because now you're not forgetting things every single week. That knowledge is stickier. And it's stickier because you have repeated that knowledge. You've reconsolidated it. You've revised it multiple times. And that's kept your knowledge topped up. Some people talk about this as deepening the neural groove. Every time you repeat it and go over it again, it deepens the neural groove, which makes that memory stickier. And so this graph that I've drawn here that shows knowledge decay is famously called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And this practice of repeating things frequently enough is called spaced retrieval. Sometimes it's referred to as spaced repetition, which is actually not technically a correct term. Now, here's the really interesting part about learning to learn, is that spaced retrieval and repeating something over and over again and relearning it basically is not the only way that you can reduce your rate of knowledge decay. You can, with better encoding, also reduce the rate of knowledge decay. And this is actually fairly obvious. Years ago, I talked about this concept and people were like up in arms, like as if this is like impossible. But actually, it's very intuitive. You know that some people, when they learn the same material, are going to forget it more slowly. You know that even for you, some subjects, some facts, some concepts, you will just remember that for longer than you will for other things. So this knowledge decay curve is not like fixed for each person. If you are like this person, it doesn't mean that you're doomed for the rest of your life to always forget everything you learn extremely quickly. Part of it is heavily dependent on the way that you encode that process. Now, the way that people encode is usually very subconscious, and part of learning to learn is turning that into an actual skill you can control. But if you do encode to a higher quality, you spend a little bit more effort thinking about how it connects together, you turn it into part of a connected schema, then it means that even after learning it for the first time, you could have a knowledge decay curve that looks like that. And now you can apply something like spaced retrieval on top of that, but instead of having to retrieve, doing flashcards or re-looking at your notes every 2 or 3 days to keep on top of your knowledge, you can look at it every 2 or 3 weeks, and that's still enough because your knowledge is fundamentally just not decaying so rapidly. You don't have to be so aggressive in how frequently you do your spaced retrieval. And this is kind of the best state you want to be in. You want your retention and your knowledge decay when you first learn something to be as slow as possible, because when you resign yourself to learning new information through spaced retrieval as your primary method of holding on to that memory, it's incredibly time consuming and also tedious and very monotonous, and it also makes you hate learning. And what can easily happen is that you get this overwhelm. And if you're using flashcards, I call it flashcard overwhelm, because it means that every single day you have hundreds of these flashcards to get through, and you need to get through all of them, because otherwise, if you don't, that information is going to decay. And so this is really a moving the boulder uphill kind of situation. Like, you are constantly having to push that boulder uphill, because soon as you let go, it's going to start rolling back towards you. Whereas with better encoding, what we're saying is, let's make that hill not so steep. So even though we do need to keep pushing it every now and again, we don't have to be pushing it literally constantly. And so without a doubt, when it comes to the thing that is the most life-changing about learning to learn, it is encoding. Getting good at encoding is the thing that truly makes you feel like your experience of learning is changing. If I ask you the question, between encoding and retrieval, which skill is the most important for you to get good at first, the answer obviously should be encoding. And if you said that, you'll be wrong. And this is the point that I want to make, is that in practical reality, retrieval is actually the most important thing for you to focus on first. The reason is that retrieval skills can be learned very quickly, and they produce an immediate benefit. The benefit is not as powerful and is not as long-term as the benefits you get from learning encoding. Learning good encoding skills requires you to rewire the way that your brain habitually processes and thinks about information. For some people, if they're already starting from a high baseline, they can improve their encoding and upgrade it very quickly in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. For most people who don't have a very high baseline level of encoding, it's going to take you months, sometimes even years, to learn to upgrade your encoding skills. And so what happens is that if you get too overzealous and focus too much on improving your encoding skills before your retrieval skills are at a certain level, then you're actually going to make things harder for yourself, because now you don't have the habits of proper encoding. You don't know how to do it accurately yet. It's going to take you weeks or months to figure out how to do it accurately. And so between now and when you figure out how to do it properly, you're not receiving the benefit. And that time and attention and effort that's sunk into trying to improve your encoding skills is actually taking away from your normal studying process or spending that time with better retrieval. So your performance is actually going to drop in the immediate time. Until your encoding gets good enough, your performance is actually going to drop. And so for most people trying to get better at learning, the path that needs to follow looks like this. So if this is time again on the x-axis, and this is the amount on the y-axis, the level of encoding for most people is fairly low. And then as you slowly learn to do this, this will eventually get better. Most people start with some level of retrieval, but not much. In the initial phase, you're going to need to increase this up until the point where you're able to achieve the outcomes that you want, until you can get the level of fluency, until you can get the level of risk mitigation, until you can get the retention and sort of long-term knowledge that you need. So until you hit the objective, the outcome that you're looking for, you're going to have to do that mostly with good retrieval practice. And so let's say that with this level of encoding and this level of retrieval, you're getting, let's say your results are going from this to this. So this blue line, this is your results. This is your actual performance. This is the encoding skills, and this is your retrieval. Now, what also happens is that the amount of time you need to spend also increases, because as you do more and more retrieval, you now need to spend more and more time. So unfortunately, what's also going to happen is that the time you're spending on learning is actually going to go up. What we're prioritizing here is locking in a certain level of performance or results in this early phase. Unless you're happy to delay your performance improvements until later, we want to start by getting to a certain level of performance or results that we need for our work or for our project or for an exam that we're sitting. And then we can work on the efficiency. And so how that efficiency plays out is that as your encoding skill slowly develops, what happens is that your memory naturally starts improving. Your retention naturally starts improving. So naturally what happens is that the amount of retrieval you need to do starts going down naturally. You don't need to spend as much time doing retrieval because you're just not forgetting it that quickly anymore. There's no point reviewing it a few days later because we can leave it for a few weeks and still have the same level of retention. So your retrieval starts going down as your encoding goes up. At the same time, the time that you spend goes down as well. And because most of what is time consuming about learning is actually doing retrieval really well and relearning things and testing your gaps, when retrieval goes down, time follows it. And your performance should stay stable at worst or actually increase as your encoding gets better. And so the part that trips people up when they're first learning to learn is that they'll try to learn these, encoding strategies, but they won't focus on the retrieval strategies. Or they'll be too focused on making sure that the first thing that goes down is the amount of time that they're spending. And so what happens is that their performance just tanks because they're not doing any of this. And so their performance actually goes down and it doesn't increase until the encoding increases. And that period of time is, like I said, like months, potentially even years. So that's encoding and retrieval. So when you think about learning divided broadly into these two phases, you can think about where the issues are and then which part is actually holding you back the most. So if someone has pretty good retention, they've got solid memory, they're able to understand things fairly deeply, but the issues that they're having are that their fluency and their recall is a little bit too slow, or they're realizing that there are these gaps in their knowledge that they didn't detect before, or for some parts, maybe the knowledge decay is a little bit too fast, then I would say, okay, well, that seems to be mostly a retrieval problem. So the way that you're going to fix that is mostly by focusing in on your retrieval. Now, if someone has really poor retention, their learning is really shallow, they're not able to really solve complex problems using what they've learned, they'll spend a lot of time consuming a bunch of stuff, learning a bunch of stuff, and they'll look back on it. They don't really remember what they wrote. They don't really know what to do with this knowledge. They kind of get more and more confused as they're learning. That's really clearly an encoding problem. It means that as you consume information, you're not turning that into usable memory, usable knowledge structures. All you're doing is just hoarding resources, basically. And so that ultimately is something that needs to be improved by getting better at your encoding. And so that's something that you should be working on. Slowly working on the side, just getting better and better at it gradually, letting your brain find new ways of thinking about and processing that information. However, in the interim, you're going to need to beef that up with better and higher quality retrieval methods. And so what I'm going to go through now is how you should be thinking about retrieval, what type of strategies there are in retrieval practice, and how you get good at this. But before I get into that, I want to let you know about something that might help allay some of your confusions. We've covered a lot of stuff, and this is really just still scratching the surface, like not even scratching the surface. We're just blowing gently on the dust on the surface when it comes to learning to learn. And so it's common to be confused about what you need to work on, what's important for you, what your next step needs to be. And so to help you a little bit with that, there is a free quiz that I've made, which will have a look at the learning system that you're currently using. And it will then break that down, and then it will tell you, hey, this is the part that probably is the weakest for you. You should focus on this. It'll give you some recommendations and some instructions in terms of how that's going to help you and what you need to do to get better at it. And so if you're looking for a tool to sort of quickly assess where your current situation is and get a bit more direction, then I'd recommend checking out that diagnostic. It's a learning system diagnostic quiz. I'll leave a link in the description for you if you would like to check it out. It's totally free for you to do, and you get that personalized report at the end. Now, let's dive a little bit more into how you get really good at retrieval. Now, when we're talking about retrieval and getting good at retrieval, we have to remember that retrieval is really about using your knowledge. So it's useful to think about this in terms of how you're going to need to use your knowledge for whatever you're learning this for. And we want to somewhat match the way we need to use this knowledge with the retrieval practice that we're doing. We're basically simulating the real world experience for ourselves. And the two dimensions of retrieval you want to nail down is the method of retrieval that you're using and the frequency. I'll talk about frequency first because this is an easier one to understand. And we've already talked about this concept with this forgetting curve here. As you know, and we've discussed, your knowledge is going to fade. Your memory is going to fade. This is called knowledge decay. You don't want to wait so long to retrieve something again that knowledge is almost completely evaporated. You want to hit that knowledge after you've given enough time for meaningful forgetting to have occurred, but not so long that you've actually forgotten all of it. And so this is actually just going to be a judgment up to you. You're going to have to try it and see what that frequency looks like. For most people, I say that you should try to review something new that you've learned 1 day after learning it, then 1 week after learning it, and then 1 month after learning it. But this is sort of just a starting template. This isn't saying that this is definitely right for you. If you learn something for the first time, and then you do it after 1 day and you realize, okay, your retention is sitting at about 80%, pretty good. And then you do it after 1 week and you realize it's at 10%. Well, this drop is too significant. It's going to be really challenging for you to refill like 90% of the knowledge that you've lost on that day. And, take into account that you're constantly learning new things as well. So it's not like you just have this one thing to learn and then retrieve later. If you've forgotten 90% of this a week later, there's probably all sorts of other things that have happened during that week that you're also imminently about to forget. So this can become very overwhelming. So if you notice that there is this big drop, then you would move this timing forward. So at what point do you get something that's maybe like 50%? Well, ideally the same as what it was before. So you did it after 1 day, you saw that you had an 80% retention. So how long do I need to wait for that to be an 80% retention? So if I do it on 1 day and then I do it immediately the next day, probably your retention is going to be greater than 80%. It might be 90%. It might be 95% because you've literally just reviewed it the day before. And so this is going to be overkill. And so maybe the sweet spot is if I review it after 3 days, then I'm back down to 80% retention. And that's good because going from 80% to 100%, you can fill that relatively efficiently. And so you can start with this basic timing of 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, but then you actually assess your level of retention and you move those dates closer together if you feel like your retention is dropping too fast, or you move those dates further apart if you feel like your retention is also still like really strong and really good, and actually this is overkill. But the ultimate goal here is to make sure that we are hitting a certain level of frequency that keeps that knowledge topped up rather than letting it decay all the way down. And each time you top it up, it should improve your retention and make that knowledge decay a little bit slower for that piece of information. Now, this does depend on the method of retrieval that you're using. If you use the wrong method, you may be testing yourself in the wrong way. So you think your retention is really good, but actually it's either not or it doesn't actually matter because that's not how you need to use that knowledge. So a really common example is if you need to learn something for complex decision making. There's lots of different things going on at work, really complicated project. You need to make high stakes decisions. And the way that you learn about new stuff to make that decision is through flashcards and rote memorization. So you can do your flashcards and you can do your rote memorization and your retention may be 80, 90, 95%. But at the end of the day, it's meaningless because you're not testing yourself in the way that is relevant for how you actually need to retrieve it. And so when you test yourself in that way, you may realize that actually your ability to use that knowledge functionally is only at 50%. And so this is why it's really important to be clear about how we need to use this knowledge. And then that becomes our Northern Star. That becomes the goal. And the retrieval method springs back from that. But the major aspects about getting your method right are that, first of all, it should be generative. So what this means is that it needs to involve you actually doing something with that knowledge rather than just thinking about it. If you just sit there and you mentally review everything that you've gone over, there is some benefit to just doing that, but that benefit is not going to be as strong and also just not worth the time and opportunity cost of instead generating something with that knowledge, like creating a question, creating a problem, solving a problem, explaining it, writing it out. Actually force yourself to do something with that knowledge. And on top of that, you should try to push yourself to manipulate that knowledge. In most situations, you generally don't want to be in a habit where the method of retrieval you're using is simply just recall. That may be okay if you are studying for a specific exam and you know that those exams need you only to just recall information. But especially in a professional context, and especially even just in more like slightly more complex exams, the way that you need to use that information is often going to be with other pieces of information. Like, it's not enough just to know this fact. It's like, now that you know this fact, what does that mean in terms of this? Or how do you apply this fact into this? Or when you combine these two facts, what happens? And so when you practice your retrieval, you want to get used to using that knowledge for something as opposed to just like recalling it and saying it for what it is. And finally, you want to make sure that you're doing this as much as possible from memory. This is using something that's called free recall. Free recall means that you're recalling that information from your memory. You don't have any cues and you don't have any structures that kind of make it easier for you to recall this information. For example, if I have a fill in the blanks, that's not free recall because you have the context of that entire sentence minus the blank. That will be cued recall. Whereas if the question is saying, here's this problem, how would you solve it based on everything that you've learned? There's very little structure, there's not as much guidance, and you're needing to recall lots of different ideas from your memory, manipulating it, doing things with it, generating a response, and that is going to produce the greatest overall benefit to your memory and your understanding. If you struggle with doing that, that's not a bad thing. Because remember, one of the main goals of retrieval is to find gaps. So when you do the retrieval and you realize, hey, I'm struggling with this. My fluency is not very good. I've got knowledge gaps. I'm forgetting things. I don't know how to use the knowledge in this way. That's not a bad thing. That's telling you this is a gap that you need to work on. And it's a good opportunity to work on it before you needed it for whatever real world actual thing that you need. As a little pro tip, if you're a working professional, there's a really big problem with trying to do retrieval practice, which is that it just adds more work onto your plate. And that work is not necessarily directly related to the actual work you need to do. Like creating a retrieval strategy for yourself to top up on your knowledge feels like it's not really helping you like get the job done or finish a project or like deliver for a client or something like that. And so it can be difficult to fit retrieval strategies into your schedule. And this is the point that I want to make about this, is that retrieval doesn't always have to be a deliberate, separate session. In fact, if you're a working professional, I would actually encourage that you have that as your last resort. There are two different ways that you can think about doing retrieval. One way of doing this is deliberate, and the other is opportunistic. And you want to do as much of the opportunistic as you can. Deliberate means that you're actually setting aside time in your schedule separately to create a retrieval strategy for yourself and use that strategy. Like you're doing your flashcards, you're answering questions, you're generating questions, you're getting yourself quizzed using ChatGPT. You're like literally setting aside separate time that you normally wouldn't spend to do this retrieval strategy. Opportunistic means that you find ways to do retrieval in your existing workflow. And this is better for three reasons. First of all, it's more time efficient. You're already doing things, find ways to do retrieval doing that, and that means that at the end of the workday, you've already done retrieval. You don't have to spend extra time outside of work or on the weekends. Second of all, it's easier to make it more relevant to what you're actually doing at work. So the gap between learning something new and then making that learning purposeful and applicable and relevant to your context gets shortened down by a lot. And number three, deliberately trying to create retrieval strategies in your existing workflow can actually increase the value that you're able to do at work compared to not doing that at all. I'll give you a really common example of doing this. Let's say I learned something new and I'm a manager or a team leader and we're tackling this new project and I have to learn all this new stuff to be able to deliver on this project properly. I might decide that I normally need to brief my team in terms of how we're going to run this project. And I'm going to identify that that's an opportunity that I could turn into a retrieval strategy. And the strategy I'm going to use there is teaching. So I'm going to try to teach from memory what I have learned. And I'm going to manipulate that by packaging everything that I've learned in a way that feels logical for the team to understand. I'm going to organize the knowledge, I'm going to package it up, I'm going to teach it and deliver it in a way that I feel is intuitive and logical and allows the team to have clarity and alignment and know what they need to know to be able to deliver on this project properly. And that might be a 30-minute 45-minute training session that's wrapped in as part of a briefing meeting. Now, I might not normally think about doing that, but by doing that, not only am I creating value and clarity for my team, I'm also consolidating my own knowledge. I'm doing good retrieval that strengthens my own understanding, finds gaps, and I'm doing that at a frequency which is probably early enough. I've just learned it, and I'm going to teach that the next day or 2 days later in a briefing meeting. And so I encourage you to think about your existing working day and think about any time that you need to use what you have learned and ask yourself, is there a way that I can do the same thing but just draw a little bit more on my memory, test my memory a little bit more, generate a little bit more, use that information and manipulate it a little bit more, and just turn that existing task into a retrieval opportunity. The only things that you need to have deliberate retrieval sessions for are the types of things where you're not using that on a daily basis at work. You might need to have a separate retrieval session scheduled in just to be able to top up on that knowledge. Okay, so let's zoom out now and just do a bit of a recap. So we've talked about how you should think about learning as a system, and that is broken up into two components, encoding and retrieval. Why encoding is important for your memory, but why retrieval is actually practically usually the most important thing to start with if you're a beginner. We've talked about the ways that you can do retrieval correctly and that you need to make sure that the method and the frequency are matched up. And if you're a working professional, you should find more opportunistic ways of doing retrieval instead of deliberate sessions. And throughout this explanation, I've spoken a lot about working with information in different ways, like just fact recall versus solving complex problems. Like that theme has come up a lot. And this is actually a really important other way of thinking about learning that translates to not only the method of retrieval that you use, but also the way that you do encoding correctly. And this is the idea of orders of learning. It's really important to understand the orders of learning because it gives you an easy way to identify how much you need to learn something. How deep do I need to go? How good do I need to be at this topic? It becomes a guideline for the types of retrieval strategies that you should use. If you need to be really good at a topic, you find the right order, and then you find a retrieval strategy that's going to hit that order. And this also translates to the way that you do your encoding. If you know that the way you need to think about something and learn something is at a certain order, you make sure that you do that type of thinking up front when you first learn that information. And so in your daily learning experience, understanding the orders is going to become your mental goalpost of how you know when you are learning something good enough. And the easiest way to break up orders of learning is just into higher order versus lower order. Lower order learning is when learning is very isolated. This is talking about individual facts, understanding individual concepts, explaining things in isolation. You do a lot of this when you're doing early schooling and you're just asked to explain a concept, recite a definition, regurgitate some facts. That's all lower order. At a certain point, it flips in that most of the things that are valuable for learning are higher order. And higher order is when information is integrated. This is when concepts aren't just meaningful to know by themselves. Concepts are important to know because of the influence and the impact that it has on something else. This fact is not something that is just a fun fact for a party trick. This fact is important because that influences the way that you make decisions about something else. And so anytime you need to do any kind of prioritization or evaluation or comparison or complex problem solving, these are all higher order knowledge requirements. Prioritizing something accurately means that you understand the implication of prioritizing one thing versus or the other things that you could be prioritizing. When you evaluate how important one thing is, you're evaluating its importance relative to the importance of everything else. So if someone's trying to solve a complicated problem, but they're not used to thinking at a higher order, they don't know how to start. They don't know how to approach things. They understand that there are lots of different concepts working together. They understand that they're related to each other, but they don't know how to navigate those relationships. They know it's connected, but all it does is create overwhelm, as opposed to someone who's good at thinking at this higher order and they're used to it and they've tested themselves and they've encoded the information in this way. They can say, hey, yes, all of these things influence each other. Here is the way that they influence this. If I change this thing goes down. If I remove this, I need to replace it with this. They understand how the components connect, and so they can work with that knowledge in a productive way. Now, there's a few interesting phenomenon about working at a higher order compared to working at a low order. First of all, working at a higher order, because it's integrated, forces information to fit into a network, forces information to fit into a schema. And this is how your memory works. Your memory is stronger when information belongs inside a network or a schema. And so when you try to learn things at a higher order and you try to apply your knowledge at a higher order, your memory gets stronger. One of the results of this is that you achieve this flatter knowledge decay curve that we were talking about. And as I mentioned there, if you're not used to thinking in this way, where you're constantly comparing information, thinking about how one thing relates to another thing, thinking about which is more important compared to other possible options, this is difficult to do. These are new habits of thinking that you need to develop. Now, sometimes you do need to learn at a lower order as well. Like I said, sometimes there'll be certain examinations that you could try to integrate everything into a big network and a schema, but it might take you so long and you only need to learn like 50 different facts. It's faster just to smash those through some flashcards. You just have to accept that that information, because it's not connected into a schema, so this is not in a network, not in a schema, this information is going to be lost very quickly. So the knowledge decay is going to be very fast. Again, sometimes this is acceptable and sometimes this is actually overall more efficient, but especially as a professional, there's not many instances where lower order learning is that valuable, because most of the time you can just write it down and you can look it up later. And the ability to sort of just have memorized facts and details in isolation and only using them in isolation is pretty niche. So understanding the orders of learning has a couple of different implications. One of the implications is it gives you that goalpost on how you should be thinking about the information when you first learn it, when you do the encoding. So when this information first comes into your brain, you want to put on your higher order hat and say, cool, so here's this isolated piece of information that's entered my brain. How can I connect this with something else? How can I find a pattern here? And there are various strategies that you can use for this that I talk about a lot in my other videos. Some of the ones that I would recommend you starting with is trying some kind of mind mapping. Correct mind mapping is very effective because it forces your brain to think in relationships, because you literally have to draw the relationships. Now, you can also do mind mapping without doing higher order thinking, where you just draw things, draw some arrows and connect some things here and there. You don't really think too deeply about it. You don't think whether this is the best way or this is the right way. You don't think about other ways that you could do it. You just connect a bunch of things together and you call it a day. That's not going to be very effective. But if you're really challenging yourself to evaluate, prioritize, restructure ideas, and really get a clear, organized, big picture understanding, mind mapping is going to help you with that. Another very simple thing that you can do is creating analogies. The act of trying to create an analogy is actually a way to activate higher order thinking. To create an analogy, you often have to take a group of related concepts and facts and then think about how they're related together to find some other type of way to represent that. And when you create an analogy and you think, does this analogy make sense? That forces you to examine those relationships, whether you've understood them correctly, whether you've understood each component correctly. And so creating analogies is an incredibly effective, useful tool that you should use frequently whenever you're learning new information. You can also apply this exact same thinking when you decide on the retrieval method that you want to use. So I've mentioned that you want it to be generative, you want to manipulate the information, and you want to do it off free recall. Well, any form of higher order retrieval is actually going to be manipulating and generative by default. And one of the most famous examples of this, which is incredibly effective, is to teach something to a 10-year-old, famously called the Feynman method. When you try to teach something to a 10-year-old, you're doing a very similar thing as creating an analogy. You're thinking about how all of these things relate together. You're thinking about which thing is more important, which is less important, and how you can re-explain that in simpler terms. And then when you think about those simpler terms, you go back and ask yourself, does this still actually make sense? Is this still accurate? And because you're forcing your brain to think in networks and think in relationships, this is higher order. And because you are teaching someone, you're generating it. And because you're doing it hopefully from memory, you're doing free recall. So this is an example of a great retrieval strategy. And so what that looks like when it comes together is that you take in some new information, you draw some mind maps to try to see how the relationships play out. You spend a bit of time cleaning it up until it feels organized and it makes sense to you. You try to create some analogies with what you've learned. And as you do this, you should feel that your knowledge is not only becoming deeper and more nuanced, you're starting to see how the complicated, overwhelming parts are starting to make a bit more sense. Your memory is getting stronger. And then later, you can test yourself by teaching it to a 10-year-old, an imaginary 10-year-old. You don't have to find your local ambient 10-year-old to teach to. And then when you do this, you then test your knowledge and you find more gaps and you top up your memory. And so this is just one example. But what I said at the beginning about how what matters is the approach, the principle to follow, more so than the tactic itself. You don't have to use mind maps. You don't have to use analogies. You don't have to teach it to a 10-year-old. You can do anything you want. Any method or technique is going to work as long as you recognize the principle of trying to think in networks, think in relationships. Think about, why is this thing important relative to something else? Create connections and move away from the lower order habit of just trying to understand and remember individual facts and individual concepts. The hard part about learning to learn is not doing higher order learning. Most people can think in relationships. Most people can think in terms of why is one thing important compared to another thing. The hard part about learning is that most of us have really strong lower order habits, and it feels wrong and destabilizing and highly uncertain to not really try to remember or understand each individual thing that we're consuming. It doesn't seem to make sense to us. And so the biggest challenge is actually just being okay with that feeling. Is to learn something new and say, I don't fully understand it. I definitely don't feel like I'm going to remember it, but I understand it enough to start thinking about how it could fit into the big picture, how I can group and arrange and connect this information with everything else. And as you go through that higher order process of grouping and relating and creating connections, that is what allows you to develop better memory and retain it. And that's what allows you to understand it more deeply. And this is the part that when we talked about the myths earlier on, the learning should not be easy. Like, this is the quintessential example of this. When people try to just learn things in isolation and just remember a specific fact or a concept, that's actually really easy to do. You just understand. Like, that's the easiest way of going about learning. When you tell someone, okay, cool, you don't need to understand it. I want you to see how it fits together. I want you to map how it connects together. I want you to create analogies. I want you to simplify it. I want you to group it. I want you to rearrange this information into a way that makes sense for you. That's difficult. That can be overwhelming. That can be confusing. Most people will feel that and think, nah, this is not working for me. And they'll step away. And if that happens to you, you will never get better at learning. So far, we've talked about the learning system. We've talked about encoding. We've talked about retrieval. But there is still an aspect that we haven't talked about yet, which is the self-management aspect. And this is something that I call the enablers. Enablers are sort of the third part of a learning system because it's not tied to your ability to learn exactly, but it's what gets your butt in the seat. It's what allows you to, when you have 3 hours in your calendar blocked out for learning something, you actually do that, you sit down, and then for the 3 hours, you actually get high quality learning out of it. You're focused, you're concentrating, you're not procrastinating, and you know how to juggle your competing priorities and manage your time. So as I mentioned, I want to show you some simple principles to help you solve the biggest self-management issues. Now, at this point, you may be feeling like we've covered a lot and it's very confusing. Like it makes sense, but you need more time. You need more examples. You need me to walk through step by step. You need to see the specific tactic or the specific strategy. And if you feel that way, well, I mean, part of it, that's good. It means you're really paying attention. If you are looking for more examples, if you want some more walkthroughs, you want something that's a bit more step by step, and you're not trying to figure out how all of this kind of fits together, you just want to be told this is what you need to do, here's why you need to do it, here's how to do it correctly, then there's a couple options for you. First of all, I have a lot of other videos on this. Like each of the things that I've talked about in this video, I have multiple videos going into them in more depth. So please browse around, watch some more videos that'll help you get a better sense of things. The other option, if you want to take a little bit of a faster approach and you want something that's even more guided, where you're not even having to think about which video to watch, what's the best video to learn whatever technique, what do I need to do next, the best option for you is going to be to join my actual program. So I do have a paid program that I go through step by step, teaching you like, this is how learning works. This is what you need to learn first. I go through the learning system and all the different components with examples and walkthroughs. Now, like I said before, learning to learn takes some time. So this is not a program that you will be able to kind of smash out in a single weekend. If you are really low on time, like you're studying for an exam and that exam is like 1 month away, I wouldn't recommend joining because it's just, you're not really going to get much of a benefit in just kind of 1 month, unless you're doing the program like full time for a month. I would recommend this for people who want to improve their learning skills, want to get a really good understanding about how to think about their learning and have those tactics that are in play, and also have a bit of time to actually practice this. I completely understand the mentality of trying to get the best possible result in the shortest period of time. I have the same mentality. For me, like it took me a super, super long time to figure out how to learn effectively. I try to make that much, much faster for you and the people that are on my program, but it still takes time. So if you're in a position where you're not ready to commit sort of a few hours a week to actually improving the skill, then I'd say try to get to that position first before joining the program if you want to. If I look at the data on who tends to find our program most effective, it tends to be people who have lots of stuff to learn. Like there's constantly new learning coming up, and they're trying to fit that into their busy schedules. So we're talking about a lot of software engineers, a lot of healthcare professionals, postgraduate students and researchers, as well as just your academic student, your university student trying to study for exams. So anyway, if you're interested, I'll leave a link to the program in the description. You can go on the website, read a little bit more about it, see if it's right for you. But for now, let's go into the enablers and the self-management skills. So there are 3 different ways that I like to divide enablers. First of all is time management. Next is task management. And then it's focus or attention. So time management refers to things like scheduling, time blocking. These are common strategies that are used. Task management is really talking about prioritization. When you've got a lot of things that you could be doing, how do you decide what to do? And then focus or attention management, this is stuff in terms of preventing yourself from procrastinating, not getting distracted, having good concentration, or being able to enter into states of deep flow. This is what focus and attention management is about. And the important thing is to understand that these 3 things are actually not separated. If you are great at prioritizing, but you're terrible with your time management, or you procrastinate all the time, it doesn't matter that you know what you should be doing. You can't actually do it. Likewise, if you're great at time management, but then your prioritization is terrible, it means that you schedule things and then you follow your schedule, but you're spending your time doing the wrong things. And so overall, these are not techniques for the sake of it. The point of using these techniques is to overall improve our productivity and the amount of control that we have over our lives. We want our life to go in a certain direction. We want to do certain things, learn certain things, upskill in certain areas, spend the time that we want to spend in the way that we want to spend it. All of these aspects, time management, task management, and focus management, need to work together. So as I go through to explain the principles of doing these parts correctly, you should be thinking about which is your bottleneck and then constantly evaluate and come back to where your next bottleneck is as you develop these skills. So let's start with the first one, which is time management. Time management is the easiest one to get right. It is mind-blowing how complicated people make time management, or how, I guess, overrated time management is. To do time management effectively, all you need is a schedule that you maintain and a level of time blocking. Go get yourself Google Calendar, Apple Calendar, whatever. Just get yourself a calendar. On your calendar, block out time for when you want to do things. If you want to study between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. on a Friday evening, on your calendar, go to 5 p.m. and 8 p.m., put a block there and just call it study. If you want to do your groceries on a Saturday morning, put it into your calendar. If you want to catch up with someone, have coffee with a friend, put it into your calendar. Just create blocks of time in a schedule that you maintain. As long as you do that, most of your time management problems will be solved. The skill requirement to do this right is not very high. But a lot of people feel that they have a time management problem. And they feel that way because they never have enough time. There's so much stuff that they need to do. There's not enough time to do it. The schedules that they make don't get followed. At the end of the day, there's all the stuff that they were meant to do that now has to get put back onto their backlog or move on to the next day, constantly feeling like it's never enough, no matter how much they do. Always busy, never productive. This is not a time management issue. There is one little strategy which you can do on a time management front, which is just to be conservative with your blocks. Like if you think that something's going to take you 1 hour, you just got to be really honest with yourself. Is it really going to take me an hour? And actually, this is super simple to fix as well, because you don't even have to be honest with yourself. All you have to do is actually track your time. Set yourself a schedule and then actually track how long it took. How did your day actually go? When you track your time, you will see the real life that you lived and the real way that you spent your time versus the way that you intended to. When you're first sort of new with scheduling, it's easy to get overambitious and then just pack your schedule every waking minute with stuff. As you get more experienced and you start tracking your time, you realize things take way longer than you expected them to. And so the solution to this is just to under-schedule. Be really conservative with your scheduling. Plan to do less in your day than you would like to. Under-scheduling is vastly better to overscheduling. Overscheduling is when you may call that just scheduling. That's when you plan to do all the stuff and you never get it done. If that happens to you often, where your plans and your schedules never go according to plan, and every day there's always stuff that you plan to do that you're never finishing, you are overscheduling. You are living in a fantasy world where your own interpretation of what you think you can do in a day is not based on reality. If the schedules you set are not reflective of reality, there is no point setting the schedule. You can't improve on that. And so you have to start from a baseline where you understand how long things actually take you and you schedule things realistically. So track your time and see how long things actually take you. And you may find that you don't want to schedule it that way, because that means that you're able to get even less done in a day. You had 100 things that you needed to do, and you plan to do 20 of those today. But then when you track your time, you realize to schedule it responsibly and accurately, you're only able to get 5 of those things done. Guess what? You're only getting 5 of those things done anyway. The only difference is whether you are aware of it and you can plan for it, or you don't plan for it and then you just feel like crap at the end of every day because you realize that it didn't go according to plan. Even if every now and again you give yourself like an intense packed day that's super busy and you have to be like really on the minute every minute of the day, you can do that once in a while, but that should not be your norm. When you get to a point where you can under-schedule and you see reality for what it is, now you can plan. Now you can properly plan. Because the issue of having too much to do, not being able to fit it in, not having enough time, that's not a time management issue. That is a task management issue. So I'm going to put a big yellow star next to task management, because this is the part that most people undervalue. This is the part that probably is going to make the biggest difference. This is the part that people are really bad at. 99 out of 100 times when someone comes to me and they say they've got a time management issue, they have a task management issue. And the issue is in the way that they prioritize or don't prioritize. So how do you properly prioritize? So there are a few little tactics that are going to make it easier for you to prioritize. Number one is collecting your tasks. Try not to have everything that you need to do just floating around in your head. Write it down. You can use a to-do list software if you like, or you can like literally write it down in a notebook. You can write it down on your phone and in your phone notes app. For me personally, I used to use a lot of different apps for this. I just use the notes app on my iPhone now for most of this. But the point is that you just want to have a single place where when you think that there's stuff that you need to do, you can just put it down. You can chuck it into a reminder. It's just there. You don't have to think about it anymore. The second thing is give yourself time to prioritize. This needs to become a habit. If it becomes a habit, you don't need to have like too much time set aside separately just to prioritize. You'll learn how to fit it into your just everyday life. But if you're coming from a situation where you've never really sat down and properly prioritized your tasks, you need to carve out like 20, 30 minutes in the evening, the night before, for you to go through all the tasks that you need to do and then start prioritizing them. When you first start doing this, it's going to take a while because you've got a backlist of all these different tasks that haven't been prioritized before. And now you have to prioritize all of them in bulk, like in one go. That can be time consuming, but just work through this. You have to do this if you want to solve the problems about having too much to do and not knowing how to do them. And so here's what you're going to do when you're actually sitting down to manage your tasks. You're either going to execute or you're going to categorize. When you see a task that needs to be done, ask yourself, is it going to take me more than 2 minutes? If the answer is no, just do it now. It's better to have that task off your list, off your radar, giving you the benefit of whatever benefit that task was meant to give you, than thinking about how to prioritize it. So this is called the 2-minute rule. If it's going to take you less than 2 minutes, just do it on the spot. If it's going to take you longer than 2 minutes, categorize it. Now, there are lots of different ways of categorizing tasks and prioritizing them. I personally like to use the Eisenhower matrix, but there's a very specific way that I use this if you're familiar with this. If you're not familiar with this, I'll teach you how to do it. So the steps are pretty simple. You just divide, well, at least you mentally think about these 4 different grids. And these grids sit on an axis of urgency and importance. So in this top right corner, this would be your focus corner. These are the things that have a high level of importance and a high level of urgency. To the left of this quadrant, you have things that are a low level of urgency and a high level of importance. This is your schedule quadrant. Now, this is an important point. Most people don't distinguish urgent versus important. And this is because people prioritize based on feeling. This feels important for me to do. The issue is that the human brain is not very good at feeling intuitively the importance of something that's long-term. So most of the stuff that you feel is important to do, what you're feeling is actually the urgency. And there are a lot of things that are urgent that aren't important. And the way that you should measure the importance is based on the consequence if you don't do this. So let's say I need to clean my house, right? And I haven't cleaned it for a little while, starting to get a little dusty, starting to look a little bit, like not pleasant. And this is feeling more and more important for me to do. And so one day there's a weekend that comes along. I've got all this other stuff to do. And on top of that, this household chore, give my house a deep clean, comes up. And it feels like I've put this off for too long. This is important enough that it needs to be like prioritized today. So you ask yourself, yes, we're feeling that it's urgent, but if I didn't do it, what's the consequence? So if I don't do it today, well, I'm not going to have enough time to do it for an entire other week, and then my house is going to get even dirtier. Okay, so what? And the correct way to answer this is that you balance that against the consequences of everything else you could be doing in that time. So let's say the reason I haven't been cleaning my house is because I've been really busy, and I've also been really stressed. I've been stressed in my personal life. I've been stressed at work. I've got a lot of stuff I need to do. I'm under the pump. I haven't felt good. Even if I've had time to clean my house, I didn't feel like it because I was just too burnt out. And so another thing that I think is important for me to do this weekend is to go for a run, do some exercise, start getting back on my exercise habit and rebuilding my physical health. And these two may be competing. If I clean my house, I'm not going to have time to go for my run, and vice versa. And that becomes how you assess the importance of it. Because the decline of mental and physical health may not seem urgent, but the consequence of not prioritizing this is probably greater than the consequence of letting your house get 1 week dirtier. And often, the things that are the most life-changing for us are the things that are important but not urgent. Because often the things that are here are the things that by the time it becomes urgent, it's too late. It becomes something that is, now I haven't been exercising, I haven't been taking care of my diet, I haven't been taking care of my sleep. Now I'm burnt out, depressed as hell, and now I need to quit my job to give myself the mental space to recover. So now it's urgent for me to have great mental and physical health. I can't do anything about it anymore. That's the type of thing I wish I had made that a priority 3 months ago. I see a job opportunity opening up, and it requires me to learn these different skills. That job's not going to open up for another 6 months to a year. So if you put that off, and then 6 months passes, and there's an interview that comes up, now it's urgent. You can't learn that skill. You don't have enough time yet. That becomes I wish I prioritized that 6 months ago. And the big thing that we want to avoid with prioritization is falling into the urgency trap, where every single day you're just doing the things that are urgent, but not doing enough of the things that are not urgent, but still important. Because when we stay in the urgency trap and we're only doing things that are urgent, often the things that are urgent for us today, we can fix by doing something that's not urgent. We can improve a system, learn a skill, get better at, you can learn to learn. If what's urgent for you right now is that you have to study all this material because you're constantly forgetting it, well, actually, spending time learning to learn actually solves the urgent problem that you have. Obviously, not today, but eventually. So when you spend more time in the important and not urgent quadrant, over time, that reduces the amount of stuff in your urgent quadrants. And so if you do this activity and you realize everything is always urgent, you have to think about it as, well, what could I do to prevent the urgent things in the first place? And that solution is not going to help you right now, but time is going to pass no matter what. And when time passes, you want to be in a position where at least one day you've got less stuff to worry about. And that's the reason why this quadrant is called schedule. Because it means that if there's something that's important but not urgent, you start by putting this in your schedule and you protect that time. You say 1 hour a week, 30 minutes every evening, 10 minutes every evening. I'm going to schedule and protect this time to work on this thing that's not urgent, but could be life-changing. And you actually start with that. This is counterintuitive. You start with scheduling the thing that is not urgent. And the remaining time after you've protected the other things, your sleep, your sleep routine, whatever the other non-urgent important things are. Once you've protected that time, the remaining time is what you have available to work on the first quadrant, which is the focus stuff. So this is the stuff that's both important and urgent. Now, if you go down from here, you have the stuff that is low importance, but high urgency. This quadrant is called batch, because this is the type of stuff that you want to be able to get done very quickly in a single go. This could be responding to the email. It could be doing like various house chores. But because it's not important, you don't have to do it to a high quality. You just need to get it done. Even if you don't get it done, because it's not important, the consequence is not that severe. And when you think about the consequence, don't think about it in terms of, is there a consequence or not? Think about it as, can I handle the consequence or not? Can I recover from the consequence? When I talk to a lot of students, one of the big urgent things that they have to do every single day is homework. But then in this type of situation, they're also learning from me how to learn effectively. And so I'm saying, hey, you should study in this way. And now they have to make a choice. Do they do their homework, or do they spend their time studying using a different method, which I've recommended to them, which is probably much more effective than homework? And when they try to prioritize it, sometimes they'll prioritize homework because it's like, if I don't do it, I'm going to get in trouble. So it's like, cool. So what? What's the actual consequence? You're going to feel bad. Can you deal with that? Because if the answer is yes, that's not a very big consequence. Oh, if I don't do my homework, my teacher is going to give me a stern talking to. Okay. And then what? And so again, we want to be very clear about assessing importance, not just using our feeling, but being explicit about what is the consequence. Can we handle that? Can we recover from that or not? And sometimes we can change a task into a simpler, faster version of the task that mitigates the consequence that we're afraid of without having to commit to the original full version of the task. Like if it's about doing my homework, then the alternative is that, well, can you just do your homework as quickly as humanly possible, just to the point where you're not going to get told off? Because that might only take you 15 minutes compared to 2 hours if you were to do it like to the best of your ability. Of course, many of you are not doing homework if you're a working professional, but you get the idea. And then we've got this final quadrant here, which is stuff that is both not urgent and not important. And this falls into a quadrant which is called delete, or sometimes delegate if it's possible for you in your position. This basically means that it's not urgent and there's no consequence. It's not a needle mover in your life. Just don't do it at all. And here's a hot tip is try to put as many things into this quadrant as possible. Raise your threshold of importance until you're only doing the stuff that really matters, and get used to deleting things off of your task list. If it's important enough, it'll make its way back onto your list, and then you'll be able to reprioritize it later. Don't hold on to old priorities that you're just kind of like clinging to because you just don't really want to delete them. Just delete it. Unless you have the freedom of endless time, there's always something else you could be doing. And that something else might just be relax, do nothing at all, have some me time, just chill out. If I can choose between sitting on the couch, relaxing, watching a TV show that I like in an evening so I can just unwind from the day versus doing something on my delete quadrant that is not important or consequential for my life or urgent, there is no chance I'm going to be doing that. I'm sitting on the couch 10 out of 10 times. It is better to do nothing at all than to do the things that are in this quadrant. And the two biggest mistakes I see is the first one where I talked about is urgency trapping, where every day you're just doing only the urgent things and you're not doing the things that are not urgent but still important to you. The second one is that people do not put enough into this delete quadrant. They are too afraid of consequences that do not matter, that they can just deal with. And when people feel really busy all the time, but they're not moving in their life in the way that they want to, usually it's a combination of those two issues that's causing that. You're not going to be able to solve those issues unless you exit those two traps. So that's the Eisenhower matrix. And if you can use this, and you can use it in the way that I've explained, as ruthlessly prioritizing as I've explained, then most of your other time and task management issues will start fixing themselves. And until you do this, I wouldn't hold out much hope that anything's going to change or get better. This is ground zero for improvement. This is where improvement starts. So now let's talk about focus and attention management. So as a reminder, this is about being able to focus, concentrate, get into deep flow, and not procrastinate. And while this can be a complicated topic and the psychology behind this is very complex, and there are lots of different tactics and strategies that you can use, the simplest way I think you should think about this is that there are short-term and there are long-term strategies to address this. The short-term strategies for each of these issues, like procrastination, solutions for procrastination, building habits, developing concentration, not getting distracted. The short-term strategies, these things tend to be very easy to apply. They tend to be pretty effective, but they're also often not sustainable. Either because it's literally too hard to sustain, as in it just takes too much effort to keep using that every single day, every time you need to get some work done, or the effect of it starts diminishing and it's just, you sort of get used to it. On the other hand, long-term strategies, these ones tend to address the underlying root cause. As a result, the effect is much more long-term and more permanent. But there's a very long time to value, which means that from the moment you start working on the long-term solution to the point it actually starts really solving the problem can be weeks, months, sometimes even years. And so the overarching approach is that you can use whatever short-term strategy is effective. By all means, use them. You change them around. When one of them stops working, you can switch to another one. Do whatever needs to be done, but do it with the understanding that it is a short-term solution and that long-term, you will need a long-term solution. The issue comes from when we don't understand this clearly and we use a short-term solution assuming that this is now the true solution to the problem. Let's talk about procrastination as one common example. Procrastination is largely an emotional coping mechanism. It's less to do with the fact that you love social media or are addicted to gaming or whatever it is. And it's more to do with the fact that there's a task that has a lot of work that you anticipate and that makes you feel uncomfortable, potentially overwhelmed, and you get the sense that there's going to be a high amount of effort you need to put in to complete this task. And so to avoid that feeling of discomfort and overwhelm, we pick the easier path, which is not like solving the issue, like getting the task done, and now you're not feeling overwhelmed because there's nothing to do anymore. The easier part is just to avoid that and trigger a happy feeling by getting distracted. And so it's a cognitive emotional shortcut. And so you can use short-term solutions like app blockers to remove these distractions. And you certainly should do that because it makes life easier for you. However, even when you do all of that, if the underlying issue is still there, and every time you encounter a big piece of work, the only strategy you know is either suffer through it and just do it, or find an easier alternative not to feel that way anymore. Even when everything is blocked, you will find something else to do. You'll start picking up distractions you never would have even touched before. I remember one time when I was in like a really bad procrastination rut a couple of years ago, I'd like blocked off all the normal distractions. And for me, a big one used to be Instagram. So I blocked off Instagram, and I was, in a pretty busy period with work. And I remember sitting there, huge project that I needed to start on, and instead of starting on it, I actually went onto the App Store to look for new mobile games to download and play. And like I don't normally do that. I created like a whole new behavior just to look for an easier alternative rather than facing that work. So that's a psycho-emotional thing, nothing to do with the distractions themselves. So the problem is in me. And if I don't recognize that, then I might use a solution like an app blocker, find that it's working fantastic, which is great, and then expect that that is going to be the problem solved for the rest of my life. And that's not true. The problem will come back because the underlying reason is still there. And so what I'm going to focus on are some key trends that I've observed in terms of long-term solutions that do actually work. And in terms of the short-term solutions, I think I've talked about some of the short-term strategies and tactics in other videos before. Just use whatever works. I'll give you a couple that I would recommend that you can start with because they tend to be very powerful short-term solutions. But understanding that whatever short-term solution you're using, that just gives you a bridge and some space to start building and working on these long-term solutions. Because once those short-term solutions come to an end and you're getting diminishing returns and they're not effective for you anymore, you need that long-term solution there. If those short-term solutions, you exhaust all of them and you don't have the long-term solution left, now you're in a worse place than when you started because you still have the problem, you're still procrastinating, you still can't focus, and you still can't concentrate, and now you don't have good high-yield short-term solutions to use anymore. We'll start with the short-term ones. The two that I would recommend that you can start with are blockers and accountability. So blockers are types of solutions that eliminate a distraction or a problem. So app blockers, website blockers are examples of this, where the thing that you would normally get distracted on is just you can't access it anymore. And the most important requirement for a blocker to be effective is that it genuinely feels hard to bypass. If you've got a blocker and all you need to do is like within 5 seconds, like click it and turn your blocker off, that's not going to be an effective blocker. Use blockers that take so long for you to bypass and take so much effort that you just cannot be bothered. In this situation, what we're doing is we're fighting fire with fire. There's something that you need to do. It's going to take a lot of effort. And then there's a distraction you want to access. But in front of that distraction is another wall of high effort. So now your two options are either spend high effort doing something that is productive versus spend high effort accessing a distraction. When it's effort versus effort, it's a lot easier to take the path that it's at least good for you. The second type of solution is something that creates accountability. This could be an accountability partner or an accountability group. Accountability is much stronger than reward and consequence. And so I know that there are a lot of reward and consequence psychology-based apps and solutions out there. And yes, they're nice, and they can be a nice little addition to creating consistency. Like every time you like resist a distraction or do something, have a concentrated work session, you grow a tree, or like your little jelly bean gets a little bit happier or something like that. Like it feels nice. It's good. It gives you a little bit of a dopamine hit for doing something that normally doesn't give you a dopamine hit. Like engaging in a long-term productive activity like studying or learning something, which doesn't have dopamine traditionally associated with it. You've now given yourself a way to create that dopamine. Or if you give yourself like a consequence that you're afraid of, then you're giving yourself a very primitive way to motivate yourself towards doing that productive thing. These types of solutions don't tend to work long-term because one of it is that you start getting desensitized, and so you need more and more dopamine to do that. And the other thing is that it actually just feeds into the underlying issue, which is the need for dopamine. Dopamine is one of those chemicals in the brain that we experience in the modern day at much higher levels and much more frequently than the brain is sort of naturally evolved to be able to tolerate. Like that's a very artificial type of situation. And so when the brain gets lots of frequent dopamine, it kind of reduces its ability to concentrate. And so in a way makes the problem worse. And so the reason accountability solutions work so well is that it replaces that dopamine-based mechanism with a social mechanism. So instead of being motivated by sort of a short-term fluctuating feeling, it's trying to resonate more with a deeper sense of identity. So if you say to your accountability partner, hey, I'm going to do this thing, this is my goal, then the motivation becomes your sense of identity as being, I'm a person that keeps my word. I'm a person that does something and is going to follow through on it. And identity-based motivation is much more durable and consistent than dopamine-based motivation. Humans are also very social creatures biologically, and so that social mechanism is very strong. So finding 1, 2, 3 people that are like-minded, that you want to keep each other accountable with, that's a great way of using an accountability-based mechanism. Even though I say that this is short-term, you can use an accountability group for actually a very long time, partly because of the fact that the group dynamics just make it more interesting and more sustainable, but also because of the fact that as the group changes and the group dynamics change, it also, I guess in a way, keeps things fresh, stops that mechanism from being saturated, and also the identity-based mechanism, it's just more resilient to saturation. So although this is technically still a short-term solution, and you don't want to have an accountability buddy for absolutely everything that you need to do for the rest of your life, this is something that can last you pretty happily for months, even years. And so it's a great mechanism to bridge you into developing these long-term, really sustainable solutions. So what are some of these long-term, really sustainable solutions? I found that there are 3 things that you should aim to get good at. And if you can get good at these 3 things, everything to do with focus, concentration, procrastination, entering into flow becomes much, much easier. In a way, these are the 3 biggest barriers for most people. You want to get good at, number 1, being bored. Number 2, doing hard things. And number 3, refocusing. These are 3 mental skills, as in they are things that you can train yourself to be better at. And they have an outsized return on investment. The time that you spend on getting good at these things will return to you reward several-fold beyond that. So the first one is about being good at being bored. If you are not okay with feeling bored, you're going to have a very difficult experience of life. Boredom is a very healthy and natural state for your mind to be in. It's a very unhealthy, very artificial state, especially just due to social media, where you feel the need to be entertained constantly. This is that dopamine addiction. And so there are two aspects of this. On one side, constantly seeking an escape from boredom increases procrastinating behavior, increases distractibility. Being good at being bored means that you're not looking for ways to distract yourself. And so that trains your brain indirectly to just have better concentration, lower distractibility, more focus. But on top of that, being bored also has an advantage of its own. When your brain enters into a state of boredom, neurally, what happens with your brain activity is that it goes into something called the default mode network. The default mode network it's called the default mode network because when scientists first discovered it, they discovered that it's the default brain activity of people when they're just at rest, not really thinking about anything, basically when they're bored. And what happens during this time is that you get this very wandering, sort of omnidirectional, seemingly sort of random thought pattern. And what's actually happening is that your brain is using this opportunity of rest to consolidate and integrate the things that it's learned and ideas and problems it's solving. This is the reason why there's such a thing as like shower thoughts. Like you're just having a shower and you just have interesting ideas and thoughts about things. This is the reason why sometimes you're having great ideas when you're just trying to get to sleep, because your brain is given the time and space to do this wandering and integration. So if you're trying to make a difficult decision, or you're thinking about a problem, or you've been doing lots of learning and thinking or self-reflection, and you want to internalize that, and you, instead of it just being like fresh new thoughts, you want to really own that and make that part of you, and you want to have more interesting ideas and progress with your thinking, it's really important to give yourself that space to let your brain consolidate everything. And part of that is putting yourself in a situation where it can just be bored. So how do you do this? How do you get better at being bored? It's very easy. I guess very easy, but hard if you hate being bored. Just sit in a room and do nothing. Just literally just sit there and just do nothing. And at a certain point, probably like 1 or 2 minutes in, you're going to start feeling bored and you're going to start feeling restless, like you don't want to do this anymore. What's the point? You know, I'd rather be doing something else. How long do I have to do this for? When is this going to end? How much is enough? Just let those thoughts and those feelings come and just sit through it. Just keep doing that until you are okay with just not doing anything. And recognize that when those thoughts come and make you feel restless, that's basically the same things that on a day-to-day basis would be making you distracted, lose concentration, and unable to enter into deep flow. So that's the first one. Get good at being bored. The second one is get good at doing hard things. Your life is going to be full of doing hard things that take effort to resolve. And if every time you encounter something that takes effort, your response is to avoid it, that's also going to make life very hard for you. So you have to train your brain to recognize that effort does not mean bad. You want your brain to be able to understand something's going to take effort, but you just do it anyway. And this is really difficult. This is the reason why some people recommend that you take cold showers in the morning. Maybe I just need to get better at doing hard things. But I hate taking cold showers. So I haven't found that to be particularly successful for me personally. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but for me, it hasn't worked so well. What has worked well for me is just really leaning into the Zeigarnik effect. So the Zeigarnik effect is that your brain likes to finish something that it's already started. A lot of the mental anguish involved in doing something that's really difficult is the process of just starting. And once you've started, it's easier to just continue going or to finish it off. Once you've started, you can put it down, you can come back to it the next day, and it's much easier to just keep going because you've already started. And even if it's 1 or 2% through the task, just the fact that you've started makes it mentally so much easier to just do it. And so the way that I try to combat this is that anytime I feel that sense of resistance and I notice, oh, this is going to be a lot of work, and I feel that urge to procrastinate and put it aside, I just give myself the goal to leave it incomplete. So my goal is actually not to finish it at all. I'm not even concerned about finishing it. In my mind, I'm not even starting it. All I'm doing is I'm just setting myself up for when I do start it. So I'll just open up the tabs that I need to. I'll collect the resources. Maybe I'll just read very quickly to familiarize myself and get a lay of the land. I'll set up my notes. And as part of doing that, naturally I get a certain type of flow and I think, okay, maybe I'll just prep a few of the main ideas. I'll get started on a few different structures and a few scaffolds and a few questions. I'll just make it easier for myself later when I am properly starting. And half the time, I feel good enough about just doing that I'll just keep going. And it's easy enough for me to push through another like 30 minutes, 1 hour, and do a decent amount of work. In the worst case scenario, I don't feel like doing that, but I have genuinely made it easier for myself to start the next time. And over years of applying this and doing this, what's happened is that every time I feel that impulse that this is going to be a lot of work, I still feel that tendency to want to avoid that work. I think that's very biologically ingrained, but I no longer feel the need to put it off. There's almost this primitive version of my brain that is trying to avoid the work. And then there's like another version of me that knows that I'm tricking that primitive part of my brain, and it still gets tricked. Like the Zeigarnik effect is just really powerful. And so even though I still feel the same feeling of not wanting to do the work, I'm better at just doing it. So that's what it means to just get good at doing hard things. And the third thing is getting better at refocusing. So refocusing means that when your mind is drifted, get better at bringing yourself back to attention. And that point of attention could be anything. It could be some studying, could be a meeting, could be listening to someone speaking, could be just on nothing, planning, thinking, whatever it is. But it's the act of recognizing when your mind is drifting away and being able to bring it back to a point of attention. And this allows you to have deeper focus when you are locked in. You've got deep flow, you're less likely to break out of it. When you feel yourself being distracted, it becomes easier to not distract yourself. You gain more control over your mind as opposed to your mind sort of just doing its own thing and you're sort of just a passenger seeing where it goes. And so the way that you can get better at refocusing ties in very strongly with the way that you can get better at being bored. Because for both of these things, you can use principles of mindfulness meditation. And mindfulness meditation does not involve you having to shave your head and sell all your material possessions and forage for herbs in the mountain as you sit on a Shakti mat every night. All you need to do is just focus on one thing and just keep focusing on that one thing. And then every time you realize that your mind is wandering away from it, you just come back to focusing on it. So you can do mindful dishwashing. Just be really conscious of the way that you're washing the dishes and like feel the bowl and the water and everything that you're doing, and just be very, very attentive to everything that you're doing. And then when you notice that your mind is wandering, just bring yourself back to it. You can be like mindful painting. You can be mindful walking, where you're just aware of every step that you're taking and how it feels under your foot. Or the most conventional one, which is mindful breathing, where you just sit there and all you do is focus on breathing. And you just bring yourself back to breathing. And every time you notice that your mind is wandering, you just come back to breathing. The breathing one is especially good because it increases the risk of you getting bored because it's just breathing. Like it's not an exciting thing to do. But as a result, it becomes a better training tool in a way, because you're so at risk of being bored that your mind is going to wander rapidly and very aggressively. So it gives yourself lots of opportunity to practice just coming back to your breathing. And it gives you lots of opportunity to practice just being okay with being bored. And so a lot of people will do this and they'll say, oh, this is not effective for me because I feel bored. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. That's the point. Like you want to feel that way, and then your ability to bring yourself back and be okay with that feeling is the practice. When you get good at that, that translates outside of that meditation to when you feel those same feelings in your workday, when you're learning, when you're studying, to be able to control your mind and bring yourself back on focus. So those are the principles for effective long-term solutions. These are the types of things that you want to get good at and practice getting good at for months. You want to put aside a little bit of time, multiple times a week, just getting good at this across the next months, years, however long it takes, however much you want to practice this. And then in the meantime, use whatever short-term solutions are going to be effective for you to just sit down, concentrate, do the job. But understand that they are short-term. One day they will start working for you. And so when you do this, alongside some basic task prioritization and a minimum level of time management, you should have a baseline of productivity. And you combine that with a learning system of decent encoding and retrieval, operating at the higher orders, doing retrieval with the right method, with the right amount of frequency. When you combine all of those things together, not only do you have good self-management, but also you have better memory, you have deeper understanding, you have greater ability to apply your knowledge to solve complicated problems, which translates to better results and performance, both for exams and for your job. Now, even though we've talked about a lot of stuff, I would still consider this the basics, even though I think that this is going to help a lot of people get very far in their learning journey. And this stuff took me years to really figure out. If you are, again, looking for something that's a little bit more step-by-step and a bit more guided, then you might want to check out my program. Again, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Otherwise, remember, you can also check out my other videos where I talk about some of these parts in more depth and give more examples and more details and different types of tactics. You'll see the common trends appearing as you watch more and more of my videos. I hope that helps. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.